It's really nice to come in from Brisbane. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and share on something which is really passionate for me to do with the origin of rocks, because it's really a foundational issue as far as the authority of Scripture is concerned, connecting with the gospel, and so much more. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a little PowerPoint which I've prepared, and I hope that you'll be able to see it well, and it'll be able to illustrate things. The origin of the rocks, it's a biblical perspective on it. So if you come to Australia, you'll see some amazing scenery. I'm sure the same as when I went to Europe, saw some amazing things there. And just north of where I live are the Glasshouse Mountains, which are these amazing, remarkable, spectacular volcanic plugs which dot the landscape. And that's in the Glasshouse Mountains. And there's a sign there, as in most places in tourism these days, where the sign says, as people look at it, it explains it within a secular, long-age perspective, eroded by wind and water over 25 million years. So that's part of our culture these days. It's left, right, and centre. And just if you go near to Sydney, just to the west of Sydney, the Three Sisters, quite a famous outlook there, 230 million years old, we're told. And it's really difficult to connect those with the Bible. Or if you go to the centre of Australia, there's Uluru, also known as Ayers Rock, an incredible monolith that's there in the middle, in the red centre of Australia. 550 million years old is what visitors are told there. Maybe some of you have been there or even seen this wave rock, which is the edge of a pluton, a granitic pluton in Western Australia. And so the ages on these rocks really throw people off the trail and give no indication that there's any connection with the Bible or anything like that at all. But I've got a little cartoon, which I like to show to kids, but I think you'll appreciate this as well, about rocks and fossils. And I just make the point that when you dig a dinosaur bone out, like this paleontologist, he uncovers this dinosaur bone, and when he pulls it out of the ground, it does not have a label on it which says, I'm 70 million years old. Of course, we know that, but that makes the point about science. You see, the bone is the scientific evidence. You can weigh it, you can measure it, you can analyze it. That's the evidence based on observation. But the date there is an interpretation. It's speculation. It's based on what? On a person's beliefs. And there are a number of different beliefs which can be applied to be able to interpret evidence about the past. Because when the key thing is, when we dig out the bone, we see the bone in the present, but we were not there present in the past to see how it got there. And so there's two different beliefs. One is the idea of evolution. It's like looking through a lens, a worldview, and you look at this millions of years and we look at the evidence. And then there's the other lens, which is a biblical lens based on the God of the Bible who created and the history that's in the Bible. You can look at the same evidence. It's the same evidence, but a different way of looking at it. And in actual fact, you know, when you go back on the sciences, astronomy and geology and biology, everybody believed the biblical view. Was coming out of Europe with the Reformation at that time. And it was widely believed. Catholics, the Protestants, the Lutherans, and not just the church people, but even people in science. And in the Bibles which were produced at that time, and this is a family Bible that I have in my possession, and it was published in 1893. And at the top column on the left, you can see there's a date there for Genesis, and it's got dates for different things different events in the Bible. But this date for Genesis says before Christ, 4,004 years. So that comes from Archbishop James Ussher's chronology, which he became famous for. So this was widely accepted. And not just religious books, but about basically secular books as well. Encyclopedia Britannica, 1771 edition, very, very early edition. It's got an artist's impression of Noah's Ark, and it considered and portrayed the flood as a real event in history. And so we see that was the culture that was there at the time, going back those couple of hundred years or more. And indeed, geology started out with the same sort of mindset. One of the early geologists, Nicholas Steno, very famous in the 1600s, a pioneer of geology, he wrote a little book. He intended to write a bigger book, but never got round to it, which is typical of scientists. But it's called the Prodromus. And in it, he argued that fossils are the remains of animals which were once alive. And there was a lot of confusion about that at the time. And he set that out. He developed the principles of stratigraphy, how to work out which geological features came first and which came second of the order. And he developed a geological history of Tuscany. And this is the first geological history that anybody in the world has produced, Nicholas Steno, and he produced it from a biblical perspective. And in actual fact, the model that I developed and that I'll be presenting here, after I'd sort of come to this sort of way of looking at things, I realized it was the same as what Nicholas Steno had done, which I found out some years later. And so Nicholas Steno, the father of geology, started with biblical history. So what happened? What changed? Well, these are the principles of stratigraphy that Nicholas Steno developed, the principles of original horizontal layers and the order, the lower ones are older than the upper ones, and the principles of cross-cutting relationships, and quite a number of principles which he set out. But something changed, and the Apostle Peter sets that out in 2 Peter chapter 3. We read about scoffers who no longer believe, and it talks about these scoffers. It says they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being and the earth was formed out of water and by water. So what did they forget? They forgot creation. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters at the beginning. And then it goes on to say they deliberately forget that by these waters also, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. So what did they forget? They forgot Noah's flood, which just deluged the world at that time. And in the English tradition, I'm not that familiar with the European tradition, but in the English tradition, one of the key figures was a guy by the name of James Hutton, lived in Scotland. He was a physician. He loved geology, and he wrote a book called Theory of the Earth. And in this book, he set out the principle as to how to interpret the rocks when we didn't see how they formed. And this is the key. He says the past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. So we use what we see now, which we can see, to explain what happened in the past, which we can't see. And so that was the principle, and it's a rule, and he developed this rule without knowing much about the geology of the world. He knew a bit about England and Scotland and a bit about Europe, and it's a deliberately forgetting, because it rules out Noah's flood, it rules out creation. They don't even get on the table. And so this is the principle that comes in, the principle which is called uniformitarianism. It's been given a label, everything's uniform, everything's the same. And this was really advocated or really publicized, became very influential through the works of Charles Lyell. He wrote a book called Principles of Geology, and he advocated the principles of uniformitarianism with James Hutton, and in this book. Now, I like the title of his book, Principles of Geology, because he sets out the problem of being able to understand geology. And he says here, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface. So we're trying to find out what happened previously in the former years. So it's an attempt. He's not saying it's proving it. It's an attempt to explain what happened in the past. And how does he want to do that? By reference to causes now in operation. And so this became a very, very popular attitude, a very, very popular philosophy. It was adopted within geological circles, within the geological fraternity, within the academic institutions, and anybody basically who would suggest something else was often ostracized. So this assumption of Hutton and Lyell, what does it mean? What are the implications of it? Well, the first one, as Lyell said, his aim was to free geology from Moses. So it undermines the authority, the reliability of the Bible. And so the implications, the earth is millions of years old, because if we're using processes that we see today, nothing much happens geologically. You need millions and millions of years. The other implication is that the Bible is not reliable. And so we can't believe that its history is real history. There must be some other way of interpreting it. And the other thing is that humans arrived very late on the scene. They weren't there at the beginning. There was various, crustaceans and jellyfish and shellfish and things like that. And it was millions of years, billions of years before humans came onto the scene. And so it totally changes the mindset of where the world came from and our position in it. And the other thing about it is that it doesn't work. It was over 100 years of trying this philosophy that the geologists who sort of had been trained and taught in this field came to see it doesn't really work. One of the guys who wrote a book about this is a geologist who trained he lectured in the University College of Swansea, Derek Ager, and he wrote a book called The New Catastrophism, and he wrote another book about a similar sort of theme, but he's basically saying that after doing 40, 50 years of geology, I found it didn't work. Everywhere I looked, I saw the evidence of catastrophe, not slow and gradual processes like we see happening today. And he calls it the importance of the rare event in geological history. So this has sort of been a bit of a mindset change, which has occurred that was 1993. So we're looking at the 1970s to the present time, the last 50 years. And in 1993, that book was reviewed in Science magazine by a guy called Warren Ullman, and he was a director of paleontological research in New York and at Cornell University. And his review in the Science magazine, which is one of the top-rate science magazines in the world, he said this: Hutton also sold geology some snake oil. It's a bit crude, isn't it? He convinced geologists that all past processes acted at essentially their current rates, that is, those observed in historical time. So that's the idea of Lyell. But then Ullman goes on to say this extreme gradualism has led to numerous unfortunate consequences, including the rejection of sudden or catastrophic events in the face of positive evidence for them, for no other reason than that they were not gradual. So he's saying that geologists in the past, they basically went against the evidence. They ignored the evidence for catastrophe because of this philosophy. But they were still good geologists. They were very good at checking the rocks, recording the rocks, mapping the rocks. And so we end up with a thing like this, the geological time scale. You've probably seen it, this chart, which has got pictures of the various animals that we find, their fossils, and the order in which they occur on the Earth. And so they use Nicholas Steno's principles of stratigraphy and other principles like that to work out the order in which these fossils occur. And so that basically is the evidence, like the paleontologists with the dinosaur bone. The bone is the evidence. This is the evidence. There may be little odd things about it, but basically the order represents the order in which things happened through history. But the dates down the side, can you see those dates there? They go down 200 million years, 400 million years, 500 million years. That's the philosophy. That's the belief system. So we have this geological chart which presents a mixture of evidence, factual evidence, which most creation geologists could agree with. They might have some disagreements, but basically it's the evidence, but not the beliefs. There is quite a bit of discussion in creation circles about the geologic column, but by and large, I consider it a fairly reasonable order in which the rocks were formed, although it does throw us off the trail a little bit. And this philosophy, I showed you the pictures of around Australia, all the different tourist features and the ages that comes out of this. And the same thing in overseas. USA, Grand Canyon, over 1 billion years old. And so this is the way it's presented. And another one is in Brisbane. There's a dinosaur fossil which is on display in the local museum. 100 million years ago, it roamed around Queensland. It's found near a town called Muttaburra, and it was called a Muttaburrasaurus. That's what they gave it. And so you can see it's dead. I tease some of the kids when I talk to children about this. I ask them, but I say, it's obvious to me, it looks dead. And that's evolution. Death, suffering over millions of years leads to man's existence. That's where the idea is. That's that philosophy. It's got death and suffering is the key driver in our creation. Whereas if we start from a biblical perspective, it tells us that God created a good world. There was no death and suffering at the beginning, but death came in as a consequence of mankind's actions, of mankind's sin. And so the wages of sin is death, and that's why that's the gospel, is that God came into the world through Christ to redeem the world. And so from a biblical perspective, we say, well, we can't accept that. We're going to, and this is why it's such an important issue. And so uniformitarianism, it undermines every major Christian doctrine. And so what we're going to do is sort of, when we're looking at geology, we say, okay, we're not going down there. We're going to start with biblical history. And that's where biblical geology begins, with biblical history. A lot of people might say that this is really bad. You know, we're starting with the answer. Science is not about starting with the answers. It's about asking questions. It goes on. But it's starting with a philosophy. The philosophy is we believe the Bible records true history. The same as secular geology, it starts with the philosophy, which is they believe that everything in the past has gone on basically the same as what we observe today. So both are starting with a faith position. And as Charles Lyell said, it's an attempt to explain. And so we're not doing anything that's out of the box here. We're starting with the Bible history, and it's we can say, okay, let's start with that and see how it works to explain the geology of the world. How's it going to be as an interpretive system? And so we start with geology. We start with biblical history. And this is a little timeline showing, you know, God created 4,000 years BC. And then there's the flood, 2,500 years, something like that. and then Christ coming at the turn of the century, BC to AD, and the present time. So there's a Bible timeline of history. And so, like so many things in science, we have to use our imagination to try to understand, to develop a model, to develop a way of looking at things. And so we use our imagination and we think, okay, of all the things that are recorded in the Bible, what would have the sort of the significant effects on geology? And so one of them would be creation, because the whole world was created in 6 days. So that would be a major effect when it involved the whole of the earth. So that's one. And another one would be the global flood, where the whole of the earth was deluged and destroyed and the water covered the highest mountains. There are other things recorded in the Bible which were geologic events. There are earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that are recorded, but nothing of the scale of the creation and the flood. So we draw a little sort of a schematic of that timeline, highlighting the key geological events, creation and the flood. And in between is the history, an era, pre-flood era, post-flood era, and we turn it on its end like what occurs, the rocks in the world, you know, the oldest ones at the bottom and the youngest at the top. Pretty common sort of geological legend. And then we connect it with the rocks, because the rocks don't represent one-to-one across in that way. The rocks, it's a non-linear. It doesn't fit exactly. So we start with creation, 6 days, and it produced a lot of rocks. The pre-flood era, 1700 years, probably didn't produce much. And then you've got the flood event, something about just over a year, and you've got flood rocks, a lot of rocks there. And then you've got the post-flood era. So that's basically, in a nutshell, a biblical geological model. That's what it is. And so we've sort of developed a concept of what we'd expect to find on the earth as far as the rocks are concerned. But so we add a little bit more detail in order to sort of help us be able to identify things. And so we can divide the flood rocks and creation rocks a little bit up, and I've done that here. You can see, like flood rocks, for example, there was a period in the flood where the waters were going up, and then there was a period when the waters were coming down. And that's very complicated, isn't it? And you can see when the waters were sort of going up, the material was being washed in, depositing material, and then as the waters were flowing off, there was erosion. And we can divide it even one further, just for the sake of helping us to find our way around. And it looks a bit complicated, but it's not too complicated. So the recessive stage of the flood, where the waters are receding off the earth, and we can say, well, to start with, the waters covered the whole of the earth, and then they started to abate, started to go down. And then as the land started to appear, they were dispersed in big wide channels. So we can sort of come up with a concept like that. You've got sheet flow and channel flow. So that's basically our model. And so we can say, well, does it work? Like Charles Lyell, is it work? An attempt to explain, an attempt to have a model that's going to fit with what we see in the world. And so I've looked at some rocks. Some of the first rocks I looked at were these rocks connected with one of the beachside resorts just north of Brisbane, Caloundra, some lovely sandstone. And I discovered these sandstone rocks, this type of rock, covered a lot of eastern Australia. And it's coloured in yellow there. You can see that. And these sediments, they contain the waters of the Great Artesian Basin. And you can see they cover a number of the states in Australia. And so they're large scale. And if we look at a section of them, this is exaggerated section so that we can see it. It's 100 times exaggerated. We can see that the sediments extend some 1,000 kilometres or more across the continent. We can see the dotted lines are the layers of sediments. We can see that they've been shaved off along the top. right? And there's something like 1.5 to 2 kilometers deep across most of the area, and then in some parts there's some 3 kilometers thick there, and so that gives us an idea for what's there. And we already mentioned some of the fossils that are found in those rocks. The Matabarosaurus, this is the amazing dinosaurs. There are lots of dinosaurs found in that area. And also, another amazing thing is people who've been inquiries have discovered dinosaur footprints. And this is a big shed, a tourist facility, which is placed over an old quarry so that people can go in and look at these footprints, these dinosaur footprints. They stand on this walkway, and you look down at the footprints, and you can see there's little ones and medium ones and a few big ones which have been uncovered in this quarry. And of course, for the dinosaur footprints to be made, the dinosaurs had to be alive. And when you go there, if you do go there, it'd be nice to go there. You can see they make up a story about what the dinosaurs were doing. And so there's just a little bit of evidence that we've looked at, and we can look at a bit more, but that's enough for us to come to a conclusion on where those sediments fit within biblical history. So the sediments, these yellow sediments of the Great Artesian Basin, so they're very large scale. So it can't be the post-flood or the pre-flood era. It must be either the creation or the flood. But they contain fossils of dead animals. So you would not expect them to be creation rocks, because when God finished the creation, it was very good. So these must be flood sediments. And then we see the footprints. So it couldn't have been after the floodwaters had peaked, because all the animals had died when the floodwaters peaked. Everything that had the breath of life in it perished. So it must have been as the floodwaters were rising. And also you find there's some other interesting features in this area which point to it being very late in the flood. And so we can actually point to our geological model, an arrow, and say that's where we think those sediments belong, just there as the floodwaters were rising and before they reached their peak. So it does work quite well for those sediments. We get a reasonable classification on where those sediments fit. And so if we go to this geologic timescale, which I showed before, and we've got, well, what we do, we get rid of the dates along the edge, because that's the philosophy. So we're looking at it from a biblical perspective. And then this part in here, this is the sediments of the Great Artesian Basin. They're there. And so that means that all these sediments, full of all these dead things, must have been as the floodwaters were rising. And then after the floodwaters had risen to their peak, the floodwaters are receding. So this part is as the floodwaters were falling, and this little part at the top was post-flood. So you can see it's very non-linear. It's not an equal amount of sediment for different parts of the flood. And that was one of the surprising things that I found when I started applying this. Now, if you go to the Grand Canyon, you could do a similar thing in the United States. It's actually an amazing, amazing feature where you can see so much as you look into the canyon. You can see sediments that are something like up to a mile deep and something of that order. And so you look at the sediments and you can see that this part is as the waters were rising, these sediments were laid down, and they're very flat. The sediments are very flat. They extend for a long distance, and that's characteristic of what happens as the waters were rising. And so that's and you notice the arrow goes above the horizon, because as the floodwaters were rising, their sediments would have been deposited much more than what we see there. Then when the waters reached the peak, they would have eroded the surface, and they would have eroded it flat, so that sheet flow, the abated phase you could call it. And then the canyon itself was carved after some of the surface, the plateaus had emerged above the water, and the water was flowing in big channels out of the canyon. So you've got the same sort of feature there on the Grand Canyon. And so we find it's really quite a fascinating thing. So we've got this biblical geological model, and we can put things to do with Grand Canyon on that model. We can say, well, this is where the sedimentary layers that we see in the walls of the canyon were deposited. And then this, as the waters were receding, is when the plateau surface of the at the top of the canyon was carved. And then this part here is where the canyon itself, the big wide canyon, was carved below the plateaus. And so we can actually tie geological events into biblical history in this way. Now, of course, it's just only a very summarizing thing what I'm doing this morning. And but to find out more information about it, there's a lot of information on the website, Creation Ministries website. And this is just a screenshot of the website and some of the things that are on there each day, a new article. And it's called kreatikon.com. I always make a joke about, where do you go to find out about creation? It's kreatikon.com. And I find that people remember that very easily, kreatikon.com. So if you go there and you look for something to do with biblical geology, there's an article which is called the Biblical Geology Summary, using Bible history to interpret the rocks and the landscapes. And so it basically goes through what I've just gone through with you now, just before. And at the bottom of that article, it's actually got charts. So you can download charts of the model. You've seen one of them, but I'll show you what they're like. And there's a color ones and black and white ones, some charts. Now, the interesting thing about these charts is, there's also on that website, there's a book, Biblical Geology 101. This is written by Michael Ord and Robert Carter. And these, when I presented the paper about biblical geology to the International Conference on Creationism in 1994, Michael was there, and I met him for the first time. And he'd been thinking, we need something like this. We need a model. We need it. And he was thinking about it. And when I presented at the conference, he said to his friend, he said, that's just exactly what we need. So he's been one of the geologists who's sort of used that model. He's written a lot about it and applied it in a lot of places. And they've produced this book called Biblical Geology 101. And so that's a very helpful book. And then there's another book which is about how Noah's flood shaped our landscapes. Michael Ord again and John K. Reed. And so they talk about this very characteristic features of that the global flood produces on the surface of the earth, particularly to do with geomorphology, the shape of the earth, which if you use uniformitarianism, it just doesn't work. And for 150 years, uniformitarians have tried to explain the shape of the Earth's surface, and it's just dead easy. The flood, it just falls out very easily with Noah's flood. But I'm not going to go into that now with the time that's available. And so there's the model. When you download the chart, it'll look like something like that. And you can see there's a phase. Right at the very right-hand side, you can see the phases. I think there's 12 or 13 that are listed there. And there's to do with the creation period, the pre-flood world, the flood period, and the post-flood world, right? So that you can see those 13. And what we also did is we took those 13 periods there. Here's the 13 periods. And we used our imagination, which is what scientists do, and we thought through the events of geological significance, what was actually happening, what was happening geologically. And then we thought the next column is the characteristic geologic features. If this is what was happening, what would we expect to find on the surface of the earth? And so it's very early. Not much has happened on that since 1994, but it does provide an outline. And if you just look at the zenithic stage, the zenithic means it's reaching its peak, all right, the zenithic stage, and it says the waters entirely cover the earth. All land creatures are destroyed. Everything with the breath of life in it perished. That's what the Bible says. So that's what was happening at that time. And then you can think of what would you expect to find. And then we'd expect to find that the sediments were of continental scale. We'd expect that they have been significantly disturbed and that they would have been plastically deformed. We'd expect to find signs of terrestrial life, which would be like dinosaurs, and signs of death, which would be like their fossils. And we'd expect to find plateaus and lots of erosion. So that's the zenithic phase. And so you can tie that down to that particular phase we can identify the rocks in the field. So that's very useful. Now, what I discovered, as I said, that we set out what we'd expect to find for creation rocks which formed during creation week. Now, we do find, as we have applied this, we find that there are lots of rocks which occurred in the flood and in the post-flood world. Flood rocks, they are present on the earth, and we're able to examine them. But we haven't found creation rocks and pre-flood rocks. Or put it this way, I'm not aware of any that are absolutely for certain to be creation rocks. Now, there would be some creation geologists who would point to some rocks and they would say these are creation rocks. But I tend to be a bit not so convinced about that. And the reason is because we find certain features in these rocks which you would not expect to find occurring during creation. For example, this is an article which was written about some 3,200 million year rocks which were examined and found in Australia, Western Australia, at the Pilbara there, just in the northwest of Western Australia. And the scientists who reported this, they said that they took some rocks and analysed some rock samples from the Kangaroo Caves formation. And they talk about that. And they describe the Kangaroo Caves formation as 3 to 4 kilometre thick pile of volcanic rocks. 3 to 4 kilometre thick pile of volcanic rocks, ranging from basalt to dacite to rhyolite. When you think of 3 to 4 kilometre thick pile of volcanic rocks, that doesn't sound to me like the sort of thing that would have been happening during creation week and God looking at it and saying, behold, it was very good. And so I tend to interpret those as being early flood rocks with the breaking up of the foundations of the deep and the early cataclysm of the flood. Now, another article on creation.com that could be very helpful and relevant to you is called a geology transformation tool, and which deals with this topic. And if you go to this, it's how to take information which is presented within a uniformitarian framework and interpret it within a biblical framework. That's what this article is about. And it's basically a diagram. That's the tool. And the diagram is a summary of the standard geological column. You can see that this is the standard geological column, and it's got all the names and all the various areas that are on it. You've got sort of the Jurassic and the Triassic and the Cretaceous, and you've got the Tertiary, all the various parts. You've got the Precambrians mentioned there. And so the idea is, if anybody sort of observe something or read something about some rocks in the past and they give them a name like Jurassic Park, this dinosaur is Jurassic, you look up Jurassic and you can figure out where you are. Simple as that. And then in the middle there's a column of numbers, which is the ages in uniformitarian ages in millions of years. And it's non-linear. It's not even. That's really important to sort of realize that it should stretch out much more than it shows. So if you're given an age, for example, 300 million years. You just look it up on the chart. Now, alongside that are three arrows. First arrow is the arrow of floodwaters rising. The next one is floodwaters falling. And the next one is post-flood. And so it's as simple as that. And it's a preliminary. Emphasize that this is preliminary. You have to check other things to make sure that everything matches. But it gives you a ballpark to start with where things are. Now, there's this area here. You notice the arrows overlap. Same area here, because there is overlap, particularly in the floodwaters falling area, because the way mainstream geologists classify rocks doesn't fit neatly with biblical interpretation. So there's quite a bit of ambiguity there, and there's quite a bit of discussion amongst creationist geologists because of that. The other one I've already mentioned is down the bottom, where I've made the line dotted, because as to whether these are creation rocks or whether these are flood rocks with floodwaters rising. And I tend to think that there tend to be early flood rocks, and that's where that 3,200 million years fits in there. So we've got this chart, and I hope to publish a chart that people can take around and carry on them in their pocket, and that if they're going on a holiday or a trip somewhere. But if you go to the Wave Rock in Western Australia, 2,700 million years, there it is, right early. And it would be the very, very beginning of the flood, quite early, where that occurred. Then you've got the Ayers Rock, the Uluru, 550 million years. It's a bit later, but it's still early. Then you've got the Three Sisters, and 230 million years, something like that. So that's heading towards the top of the floodwaters rising. And then you've got the Glasshouse Mountains, 25 million years. And you can see that's as the floodwaters are receding. And so it's quite a good way of being able to just figure out where you are and not be so confused. So I think I've got time just to deal with this briefly, to do with the dating. And it's only going to be just very, very, very quickly. Absolute dating. The relative dating goes back to Nicholas Steno, and it's reliable. The geologists are very good at doing that. But the numbers of the ages, 300 million years, etc., that are put on, they come from radioactive dating. For example, like potassium argon dating. And they say it's, the people who promote this or teach this, they'll say, look, it's just like an hourglass. Potassium's changing into argon. You just read what's in the glass and you can work out the date. Well, the problem is you don't know the starting amount. That's the big thing. We can read it in the present, but we can't go back in time. It's the classic problem of geology. And then you don't know if anything's changed to that or to that since the rock became crystallized and became sealed. And also you don't know if the rate has always been the same. And so there's a lot of material on creation.com about radioactive dating. There's this very, very simple article here about it, gives an analogy and a example. But in a nutshell, no instrument can measure age. So no matter how complicated or how technical or how precise, we need not be fooled, because they can't measure things in the past. So we can't measure the age. They measure something in the present, isotopes, but not an age. All dating methods are based on assumptions. So you have to make an assumption for how the isotope got in there. And so they might use a little model or something which they base their calculations on. And you can get any age you like, depending on the assumptions you make. And also, the geologists don't accept the dates. Geologists don't accept a number that comes out of these machines if it doesn't fit with their expectations. And there's articles on creation.com which explain some of the techniques that they use to try to make dates which conflict, to make them show that they actually agree. And it's called interpreting the results. And there's a lot in that, but that's hopefully enough to whet your appetite. But There is a way of knowing how old things are, and that's a sure way. It's based on eyewitnesses and a written record. That's where my birth certificate is based on that. My mother was there at the time, the doctor was there, and based on those eyewitnesses, as long as the eyewitness was telling the truth and the record's not been changed, as long as it's like that, we know it's a reliable age. And that's how, for example, in our country, we know that the first fleet arrived in Australia from Europe on the 26th of January 1788. And we know that from historical records, people writing letters home and putting in logs. And that's how we know the age of the earth. And this is a little cartoon with Adam, at the beginning, at the top, and at the left-hand side, and all the different people that are mentioned in the Bible, following it through all the way to Christ, based on real history. We know that the earth is about 6,000 years old, 4,500 years before Christ. And so to find out more, if you're wanting more information, the creation.com is the place to go. And if you want to get sort of advised of new information that's coming up to date and things which are in the news, you can get connected to an email newsletter, connect.creation.com, and you can connect there. And a lot of people find that really helpful, and you would too. And this is a summary, very briefly, and it's got quite a number of points. Biblical geology versus uniformitarianism, long age geology. So uniformitarian geology, it's an anti-God philosophy. It's against the God of the Bible, the God who revealed himself in the Bible and who created, as the Bible says, and he brought the flood on the earth. It's anti-God. And that's drastic, but that's the way it is. Uniformitarian geology, the result is the Bible's not reliable. That's what it's saying, and that's what people think these days. And uniformitarian geology, as I've mentioned, it does not work. And mainstream geologists recognize it does not work. And they are playing with other sorts of ways to try to get it to work. One of the ways is to call it actualism or something like that. But biblical geology, we start with the Bible, and we show that that's quite valid to start with the Bible. After all, it's the truth. And biblical geology, we find it does explain the world. It's very powerful. And biblical geology, because it starts with the Bible, it supports biblical doctrine, Christian doctrines about the goodness of God, about the world being good, the origin of sin, and that sort of thing. And so 2 ways of looking at the world, evolution and the Bible, that's the biblical model, and that's what it looks like, and nice colors and that sort of thing. And so it should be, when there's a museum, it should say on the sign, buried in Noah's flood 4,500 years ago. It should say that, shouldn't it? I mean, our government institutions should not be propaganda vehicles. And when the signs around the Glasshouse Mountains, they should say eroded as the waters of Noah's flood were receding some 4,500 years ago. And so Psalm 33 verse 4 says, the word of the Lord is right and true. That's why we start with it. And he is faithful in all he does. So I hope that's been encouraging for you. And I'll just stop sharing my screen and I'll be able to see you. And I don't know if there are any questions. There may be a lot. There may not be many. We'll see.